Good morning, students. Yesterday, we had seen, in terms of the topic economic expansion, we had seen how in Roman Empire, um, olive oil, wine, these were very important items, and especially from their Mediterranean areas. These were the items which used to get and earn enormous amount of money for the Roman Empire, though there are other exports, and the items of trade were, of course, mining and brickyards and all the wheat, and all of this was surely there. But for the Mediterranean areas, a great amount of revenue used to come from these two items, which were wine and olive oil. Something, students, if something which remains true even today. A huge amount of earnings for the countries of, say, Greece or Spain, all these areas come enormously from their products like olive oil and wine. Okay, so continuing with that, coming to this paragraph here, the empire included many regions that had a reputation for exceptional fertility. Campania in Italy, Sicily, the Fayoum in Egypt, Galilee, Byzantium, Tunisia, that is. Students, please do not confuse Byzantium, which is in Turkey, with Byzantium. Byzantium would be in Tunisia, which is again in North Africa. It has nothing to do with Turkey. South Gaul, Gaul definitely is France. If you read, you've been reading Asterix comics, Gauls are the ones who are always been defeated and beaten and harassed by Asterix and his bunch of friends, and Betica, that is southern Spain, were all among the most densely settled or wealthiest parts of the empire, according to writers like Strabo and Pliny. The best kinds of wine came from Campania, Sicily, and Byzantium. Exported large quantities of wheat to Rome. Galilee was densely cultivated. Every inch of the soil had been cultivated by the inhabitants, wrote the historian Josephus, and Spanish olive oil came mainly from numerous estates, fundi among the banks of the river Guadalquivir and in the south of the Spain. Now, on the other hand, this is important. On the other hand, large expanses of Roman territory were in a much less advanced state. For example, transhumance was widely practiced in the countryside of Numidia, that is modern Algeria. Students, it is already written with the asterisk here. The transhumance is the herdsman's regular annual movement between the higher mountain regions and the low-lying ground in search of pasture for sheep and other flocks. Students, this is something which continues even today in many parts of the hilly regions of India and around the world, for that matter, where when the vegetation and the food items, it gets very difficult to find during the winter months. The herdsmen bring their animals to the lower elevation, and and as the situation, that is the weather, improves, then they go back. So this was something which has been happening for thousands of years, and every community in any part of geography has been following this practice. But then the first sentence, that is, on the other hand, large expanses of Roman territory were in a much less advanced state. Now, students, we get an impression when we talk about the greatness of Rome and the massive size of the Roman Empire and how massive its army was, and all the great rulers that are now part of history books. It gives you an impression that Roman Empire was wealthy and resourceful like no other ever. Now, students, of course it was resourceful, of course it was wealthy, and of course it was successful in attracting the best talents from around the world. But at the same, at least, if not around the world, definitely from Europe and North Africa and Asia, particularly Western Asia. But of course, people even in that part of the world, that is people living under Roman Empire, even they were, a lot of people of them, among them were the underprivileged and the unprivileged lot. Uh, these pastoral and semi nomadic communities were often on the move, carrying their oven shaped huts. So, naturally, students, there would be a lot of people because of the kind of choice they have made for their lives. There would be a lot of people who would be out of these urban settlements, and naturally, they would have less access to the resources of production. They would have less, they would own less resources of production, because they are always on the move from one geography to the other, depending on whichever the season is. They are sometimes here, they are sometimes there. So naturally they are never settling in one particular place, thereby the access to resources of, and the resources of wealth, the resources of production, naturally is very very limited, thereby making them poor. Surely that is how it was, and that is how it is even today, for that matter. Uh, Now, we should also be careful not to imagine that because this was the ancient world, their forms of cultural and economic activity were necessarily backward or primitive. On the contrary, diversified applications of water power around the Mediterranean, as well as advances in water powered milling technology, the use of hydraulic mining techniques in the Spanish gold and silver mines, and the gigantic industrial scale on which those mines were worked on in the first and the second centuries, uh, the second centuries, with levels of output that would not be reached again till the 19th century, some 1700 years later. Okay, so this tells you the vastness of mining, and the elaborate scale of mining. Then also the fact that how many people must have been employed in that industry, because if we are talking about an output which could not be matched for another 1600 years, it speaks volumes about the number of people that must have been employed, and it also gives you what they are trying to say is they were steadily were improving on their technology. Otherwise, this thing would not have been possible to achieve. So, students, you have to now understand one very important thing. 1500 years ago, 2000 years ago, those were not the days of capitalism. Those were not the days of, a situation or a society whereby you had labor rights, whereby you had laws that would govern the businesses, the industries. No, we are not talking about that world at all. So, naturally, there was a certain amount of disparity which exists even in the modern world, in spite of all the laws which the governments promulgate all the time, and despite of all the guarantees, the constitutional guarantees which every citizen of a particular country gets. But in spite of that, there are huge amount of disparities. Now this is something, because that's how it has always been. That is, and not that that's why it has always been so, it would be so. But the point is, that is what is human nature. You cannot negate this vital factor which happens to be human nature. You have to understand that in those years, what would a person need? He would be happy with, you know the basics that he had. No one needed two flats and three flats, and no family wanted an Audi or a Mercedes for himself. They were happy with the number of animals that they had. They were happy with the livestock that they had. They were happy living in caves. They were happy moving around in the jungles, hunting. Those were the things that kept them occupied, that gave them happiness. Today, probably an Apple laptop or an iPad gives you happiness. A smartphone gives you happiness. Air travel gives you happiness. Eating in fancy hotels gives you happiness. But people were looking for different sources of happiness in those years. So you cannot, that's what they are trying to say, that just because they were not keen about certain things which modern society is very much keen and concentrates its energies on, that doesn't mean that you would say that they were not an advanced, or that's a society, or that society was not progressing in real terms, just because probably they were living in huts. Okay, now controlling workers. Uh, that is that is the next topic. Controlling workers. Slavery was an institution deeply rooted in the ancient world, both in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, and not even Christianity, when it emerged and triumphed as the state religion in the 4th century, seriously challenged this institution. It does not follow that the bulk of the labor in the Roman economy was performed by slaves. That may have been true to a large true of large parts of Italy in the Republican period. Under Augustus. There were still 3 million slaves in a total Italian population of 7.5 million. 3 million, would students imagine this number? 30 lakh slaves. Okay, out of a population of 75 lakhs. Okay, so that is a huge number of slaves, right? Now, students, what they are trying to tell you is that slavery, and yeah, just looking at the number, these massive numbers, it is very obvious that this institution, it worked as an institution. This practice of slavery was very much institutionalized. There must have been rules of engagement. There have been, otherwise it is, the word gives you an impression of slave being that is an enormous amount of poverty, enormous amount of hardship, absolutely no right, probably working forever without being paid, and all kinds of horror stories come into our minds, right? But it would not have been that way. Had it been that way, it would have become extremely difficult to manage such massive numbers, right? 30 lakh slaves out of a population of 75 lakhs. These are mind boggling figures. So you would have to have certain rules, and you would have to have certain method of engaging the slaves. And students, Romans, as I have repeatedly said during this chapter, Romans, like Mongols, they were very fair to the slaves. We do not have, of course, slavery was very, very prevalent in the Egyptian empire as well. Not much in the Indian setup, because in India, slavery never took roots in India. The richest of the rich in India, and the biggest of the biggest rulers, and they didn't have slaves. They didn't employ slaves. So we do not have, very elaborate accounts of slaves in India. Maybe a few exceptions here and there, but not in a form which could be known as that it was institutionalized. But in many parts of the world, that point in time, Egyptian and the Romans, and even the Chinese and Mongols for that matter, slavery was very, very prevalent, very, very institutionalized, and it was it was a very integral part of the social and political life of these empires. But Romans were very, very fair to to their slaves, and this was something which must have been also picked up by the Mongols when they started expanding, and a lot of slaves were brought into their fold. They were also very, very fair to their slaves. But then there are no available records of Egyptians ever being, treating their slaves nicely, because for Egyptians, slaves always meant extreme hardship, and they would use them for all the extreme physical labor, and without any rights. So the slaves under the Egyptians were definitely in a much worse condition than the Romans or the Mongols. We shall continue, students. Thanks.